Seiko didn't always get the 62 mass or 62 MAS reinterpretations right. And I can say this with safe assurance as I've owned the SPB043, the 147 in my private collection for over 4 years. The SPB043 being a cult classic, it's got the right proportions at 40.5mm wide, it's got wonderful dial balance, proportions, it is a dream and beauty to wear. But as I said, Seiko didn't always get it right. And the SBDC051 is an earlier attempt from Seiko to reimagine and capture the brilliance of the heritage 1960s Seiko diver. I have here the SBDC051 and the SLA065 to talk about them in regards to just how there is nearly no content, very little content on both of these watches, and they aren't talked about at all. The SLA065 is a different standard and grade of watch, retailing at $2,900 US new. They can be found for under $1,800 US dollars. Now the SBDC051, long discontinued, you can find these for under $1,000. I think these both represent outstanding value in the landscape of burgeoning Seiko prices that keep going up and up every year. The SLA065 had that astrolabe dial with the faux patina indices that weren't quite popular with the internet crowd, and the SBDC051 had that broad arrow hour hand with the sunburst blue dial, a larger case at 42.6mm that just didn't sit well with diehard Seiko fans that were looking for a more contemporary take on a 62 mass diver. Outside of the obvious that these two dive watches have blue dials, dark blue bezels, and are cased in steel, when they were released, they were not met with immediate glowing reception. Let me explain. Back in 2017, the SBDC051 was released next to the SLA017, which I think is the more accurate reissued tribute to the original 62 mass. That wonderful gray dial, the slender case, and the almost one-to-one accurate dial with the chunky squared off indices. The SBDC051 was everything but that. It had those rounded off indices and that broad arrow hand, larger case design, which sparked some dividing opinions on the watch. Primary complaints include those wishing for a smaller case design, the elimination of the broad arrow hour hand, and a more faithful design, similar to the SLA017 without that $4,000 price tag and limited production of 2,000 units worldwide. The SLA065 on the left, when it was released back in 2023, many clamored that this was their second chance to get a similar watch to the SLA017, but it was anything but that. Larger case design, astrolabe dial, those are one of the things that separate them. But another thing that differentiates is the case thickness. About 0.7mm of case thickness separates the two watches, being that the SBDC051 pictured on the bottom is thicker. Now, the grammar of design language is carried through both watches, but more prevalent on the SLA065 with the squared off mid-case design and stubby lugs. The SLA065 has a more substantial coin edge bezel than the SBDC051, which has a bit of a chamfer underneath the coin edge bezel. The mid-cases of both watches have drilled lugs. The SBDC051 does have the longer lug-to-lug length of the two watches at 49.8mm, and for the 2 years that I've worn this watch and traveled with it, the issue that presents is that it does restrict the strap options that you have. If you've got a smaller wrist, then you have to keep in mind that a longer lug-to-lug distance will lengthen the effective distance of those straps on the wrist. Luckily, the lug width is only 20mm wide, which means you should have plenty of options. Case finishing is complete with satinated fine brush finishing at the top of the lugs with a delicate polished chamfered edge separating the mid-case. I'd say that in terms of its texture and finishing, it is superb. You have to keep in mind that this is the earlier iteration of DiaShield coating, which is Seiko's proprietary scratch-resistant coating. The crown on the SBD051 is wider and shorter than the SPB043 and the SLA065 and the 17 as well. I find that the case design of the SBD051 being more curved off and ergonomic than the SLA017 and 65 lends for better comfort on the wrist. The curvature of the case, the sublime case finishing, this is really Seiko at its best. And being one of the earlier iterations, I can see people appreciating these qualities that were lost on the newer renditions of the 453 and the 143. Beating away inside is the caliber 6R15, which is a 3 Hz, 21,600 vibrations per hour, 50-hour power reserve movement. It has 20 hours power reserve less than the modern 6R35 and 1 joule less as well. For all the talk of how great the SLA17 is and true to the original 62 mass diver, the SLA65 has one major advantage, being that it is 1mm thinner than the SLA17. 13.1. This is not intended to be a dig at Seiko's dive watches being thicker, but it is a statement of fact that the caliber 6R35, 6R15, 8L35, even the NH35 are relatively thick movements that do contribute to case thickness. You have exceptional levels of case finishing here, mostly brushed finishing with a polished chamfer separating the top of the lugs with more satinated finishing. It is Seiko's use of their ever-brilliant steel, a highly corrosion-resistant material. Combined with the fact that it has Zaratsu polishing, this case catches light for days. Compared to the SPB043, even the SPDC051, the lugs are stubbier, shorter. The lug shape and the case design is more angular, more faceted, sharper. It's kind of like staring at an 8K TV for the very first time. It's just a sharper design than compared to those two watches I've mentioned. The flat sapphire crystal, rectangular indices, and squared off lug design, flat case profile with the angular lugs are all reminiscent of the SLA017 and 62 mass diver, hallmarks and characteristic traits. There are many points of adjustment. Look at all these eyelets on this tire tread rubber strap, which is 20mm wide in lug width, by the way, so you'll be able to have plenty of options if you don't prefer this strap. The Kanagawa wave motif is recessed into the case back, and the movement inside is the caliber 8L35, which is a smoother sweeping movement, 4 Hz compared to 3 Hz of the 6R, and slightly shorter power reserve at 50 hours compared to the 70 of the 6R35. Accuracy measured in at 5 to 6 seconds per day. You do get your money's worth here in terms of movement quality. As good as the rubber strap is in terms of comfort, it is a long strap. You can see on my 6.5-inch wrist that the other long side of the strap reaches over, and the keeper is quite thick as well, so you'll have to find your way to place it on the wrist where it's most comfortable for you. If you've got a smaller wrist, you may have a bit of overlap of the rubber strap as well. The bezel insert of the SLA65 is a hardened steel with a circular loom pip at 12 o'clock. I do like the color and hue of it. It's kind of an ocean blue color, coming to that save the ocean motif, if you will. You'd be forgiven to think that this bezel insert is ceramic as it looks the part, but it isn't. The 120 click bezel action is positive, very minimal backplay, good tolerances for a Seiko bezel. The bezel insert of the SPDC051 does also look like ceramic, but it is steel. It has a light teal dark blue hue that contrasts the dark blue dial quite nicely. The bezel insert has a 12 o'clock loom pip that's recessed. Action itself is great, 120 clicks. Now there is a bit of play. It isn't quite as tight as the SLA065, but that's to be expected. On the wrist comfort, it boils down to the footprint of the watches, and the SLA65 has a smaller footprint in terms of its lug-to-lug width being shorter. Now, I have to remind you, a 41mm wide case met with a 47.6mm wide lug-to-lug width means that this has a similar footprint to modern Rolex Submariners. And it certainly feels the part in terms of its on-the-wrist presence. Not too small, not too big. It really is the Goldilocks size for majority of wrists out there, all the way up to 7.5 inches. The case shape is shaped just enough in terms of the lugs protruding down to the wrist, where there is literally no gap on my 6.4-inch wide wrist. I feel that on the wrist comfort, the SLA65 has the SPDC051 beat. At a distant gaze, the SPDC051 will look larger than the SLA65 on the wrist. There's no denying that a 42.6mm case with a conservative 20mm lug width will have a larger footprint on the wrist. But I don't think that's a bad thing. The dial proportions, the use of space within it is all very well done, and the exaggerated hour hand with that arrow is very legible on the time-telling basis of day-to-day. I do find that comfort on the wrist, it is a heavier watch. There's no shying away from that. The shape of the case does lend for wrist comfort, although maybe not as comfortable as the SLA65. There is a small bit of a gap because the 49.8mm lug-to-lug width is longer. but I do think it's still a comfortable watch, and it does have presence. I would argue the SPDC051, any of the older 62 mass reimaginations, have better wrist presence than the smaller SPB143 variants. Not everyone is a fan of the astrolabe circle design on the dial of the SLA065. It is used for tracking time relative to where the sun and the stars are in relation to the horizon. The astrolabe was actually a 6th century scientific instrument, and I think it's such a cool addition to a dive watch, understanding that this astrolabe tool was central around navigating the seas. The dial quality of the SLA065 is on a different level. The indices have these beautiful striated brushed finish. The SPDC051 has much more simpler dial finishing, the printing not nearly as sharp, the hands are not faceted or polished like the SLA065. The sunray blue dial of the SPDC051 is a dark blue hue that looks like you're staring into the depths of the ocean. The date window framed by a simple white rectangle. Everything here is done to a good degree of quality, albeit just scaled down, much more simple than the SLA065, but by no means poor in quality. This is excellent. So I do believe that when we think about value for money and what that stands for in our current state of affairs in collecting watches, the SLA065, now that you can find them on the pre-owned market for $1,500–1,800 US, it is a steal. The SPDC051, great for larger wrists, and I think it's definitely one worth visiting if you prefer a modern take on Seiko's legendary diver. If you like today's video, please like the video and consider subscribing, comment, and I'll definitely catch you in the next video. Thank you so much.